The Frierdiker Rebbe passes away. For Hasidim, it's very difficult. But it also seems, this is sort of the impression that you get, that the idea of the Rebbe being a Rebbe was so far from his thought. The idea that the Rebbe should perceive himself as a Rebbe was an impossible thought. And I guess this is how I think and I feel, so I'm saying what I think and feel, which is usually often not a good idea. The Rebbe knew he has to be a Rebbe. I think that too. But he was so much chassid that it was so averse. There was no piece of him. There wasn't a granule of him that had any possibility in his own conscious mind for becoming a Rebbe. You hear the stories that happened that year in the beginning. The way the Rebbe reacted to the proposal with such shock that someone suggested that he should be a Rebbe. He was shocked. He was so disappointed in Hasidim that they could think such a thought, even though it was a totally reasonable thought. But his reaction was, how ridiculous is that? Like, where'd you get that idea from? And again, I personally believe, and there's a lot of evidence, like I told you last week on Tuesday, that his mother had negotiated before he got engaged that he should be a Rebbe. I still believe that in Das Tachten and in Geluyim, for the Rebbe, the idea was a completely foreign idea. So it took Pashat the Rebbe time. And it took the Rebbe time not only to prepare us for his Nesiyas, it took the Rebbe time to prepare himself for his Nesiyas. And I'll tell you a story that supports this. I don't know when this story happened, but I heard this story firsthand. I heard it from the Baal HaMaaseh himself. That in Poland, there was a Lubavitch yeshiva in Atros, Chemchet. There was a lower shiur and a higher shiur. The higher shiur was the shiur of the Rosh Yeshiva, whose name was Abudel Ebed, who was a real Gaon. He was an incredible Talmud Chacham. Rabbi Fuchs told me he ran around the whole day collecting money for the yeshiva. He'd run in a minute for the shiur, get up and give a shiur. And not only would the shurim clear and lucid, there was a hemshech from the first shiur, the beginning of this month, 6 months. He would weave a thread from the beginning. He had no time to prepare. He just knew it so well, and he knew it so deeply. He was the fundraiser. He was the business manager of the yeshiva, was the manal. He'd run and fight, and the shiurim were so good. He was such a gun. The younger Maggid shiur, the second shiur was a yid named Reb David Rikir, who was not a Lubavitcher chassid. He was a big lamdan. He was a very big Yirei Shamayim. He was a Kotzker chassid. And he gave the younger shiur to him. Kotsk was a very small Hasidus. I mean, Ger is a Kotzker Hasidus, which is very, very large, and the other Hasidus are very large. But Kotsk itself was a tiny Hasidus. And the Kotzker Rebbe passed away childless in 1937, without any children. So the Kotzker Hasidim came to this Reb David Rikir. He was a Kotzker Hasid. And they said to him, the Kotzker Rebbe didn't leave any heirs, didn't leave any children. We want you to be the next Rebbe. He didn't know what to do. He understood that the future of the community, of the movement, depended upon leadership. They needed a Rebbe. So he went to the Frierdiker Rebbe. Came to the Frierdiker Rebbe. Now girls, I heard part of the story from one Polish Talmud, another part of the story from another Polish Talmud. What I'm going to tell you now, I heard from Rabbi Fuchs. The point of the story I heard directly from Rabbi Hendel from Montreal. Rabbi Fuchs told me that he came to the Frierdiker Rebbe and he said to the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Kotzker Hasidim are asking me to become a Rebbe. What should I do? So Frierdiker Rebbe told him the following, quote, Oib Chasidim beten is a simin as a do epis. If Chasidim are asking you, that itself is the proof that there's something to discuss. Aber, however, das arois zu rufen, to call this out, darf sich überkehren die Kishkis in Boich. Your Kishkis have to turn, your intestines have to turn inside out. You get all knotted up. And then the previous Rebbe gave this Reb David Rikir a whole Seder avoid, a whole Seder what to do, verschiedene Sachen, and then he should become a Rebbe. He should accept the position. This little Hasidus called Kotsk had one rich man, one Gvir, one Chassid with a couple of dollars, or a lot of dollars, or zlotus, and he paid all the bills. He paid for the Kiddush, he paid for the upkeep of the shul. So when the Kotzke Hasidim came to Rebbe David to ask him to be a Rebbe, he was, of course, at the head of that delegation. He was a very important person in that community. So Rebbe David confided in him. Rebbe David Ulrike confided in him. How did he confide? He told them what the Frierdiker Rebbe said. He told them that the Frierdiker Rebbe said that if Chassidim are asking, that's a simon, that there's something to talk about. He also told them that in order to reveal it, the Kishkis inside out. And he also repeated to him what the Rebbe told him, how he should prepare to become a Rebbe. The whole Seder. This Gvir remembered the first part. The instructions how to become a Rebbe, as soon as he heard them, he forgot them. It was so clear that it was information he didn't need, and it flew out of his head. The Frierdiker Rebbe told Rebbe David how to prepare yourself to be a Rebbe. He repeated it to somebody else. That guy, it didn't take him a day. As soon as he heard it, he forgot it. Information that you don't need, you don't have. Now, we're talking about tzaddikim and secrets. He didn't need the information, so he forgot it. Now, the second part of the story. Harav Hendel from Montreal, Harav Yitzchak HaKohen Hendel. I had once an afternoon with him in Pardes Chana. He came for an upshandness, and there were no men around, so I spent the whole afternoon bringing with him, but he told me many stories. And one of the stories he told me was this story, that he came to the Rebbe, to our Rebbe. He said to our Rebbe that he has two proofs that the Rebbe should become a Rebbe. The first proof was Rabbi Hendel from Montreal. Harav Yitzchak HaKohen, he was the Rav of Montreal. He passed away about a decade ago, 15 years ago. He was a Polisher, a big Lamdan. He came to the Rebbe and said, I have two proofs that the Rebbe should become a Rebbe. Number one, because you were the Menal of Temchat Mimim for a while. For those who do not know, the Rebbe tried to move to Poland and the Polish government kicked him out. And by the way, in kicking him out, they saved his life. Literally, from the Nazis. The Rebbe came to Poland, he spent about 5 months, and during that period that he was there, he got involved in the yeshiva. He actually used to head the Bachrim and Chassidus, he talked to the Bachrim in learning. Then the Polish government kicked him out, he had to move back to Paris, and like I said before, it saved his life. Rabbi Hendel was one of the Bachrim that the Rebbe was farheading, was talking to him in learning. So he said to him, your father, the Frierdiker Rebbe, was the Menal Pale of Temchat Mimim. You served in that capacity for a while. That's a proof. Proof number one, that like your father-in-law, whoever's the Menal Pale of the yeshiva should become the next Rebbe. Proof number two was this story. But he told the Rebbe half a story. He told the Rebbe that Reb Davidl was asked by the Chassidim of Kotsk to become a Rebbe. Reb Davidl Rikir, something was Rikir, and he came to the previous Rebbe, and the previous Rebbe told him, quote, as Chassidim beten is a simin as a da epis. If Chassidim asked, that's proof something to talk about. But then he said, aber das arois zeruf und dafür sich überkehren the kishkis and boich, which means to reveal that your kishkis had turned inside out. So he told the Rebbe half a story. He told him half. He said that the Frierdiker Rebbe said to Reb Davidl that if Chassidim asked, it's proof that there's something to talk about. So the Rebbe says to him, Efter hat der Schwer zu dem gesagt noch epis? Maybe he said something else also. And the Rebbe said to him, are you kidding me? Is that all he said, or there was more? There's more. There's more. It gives you an idea. You get the impression that the idea of the Rebbe being a Rebbe was so foreign to the Rebbe. The idea had to grow on him. And there are different stages. I heard from someone reliable, heard from Rabbi Jacobs that in the very beginning, the Rebbe said, if you don't leave him alone, he's going to run away from New York and hide, you'll never find me. The Rebbe said that. I heard it from Harav Yitzchak Wittighesen Tzvi Steinmetz, who heard from Rabbi Jacobs. And you see, the thing was, the Rebbe was a serious man. People knew the Rebbe doesn't play games. He's not a politician. He's not a double speaker. He's not doing things for effect. He's not manipulating. He says what he means what he says. And when the Rebbe said such things, they were afraid. They were mamish afraid. They knew the Rebbe has to be a Rebbe, but they also knew that they can't. This is not a man you can push around. This is a person you have to respect. And it made it very, very difficult. So let's talk through the different stages. In the first 30 days, I told the story already. In the first 30 days, the Rebbe walked around with a black hat and a black kapota. During Shiva, he wore his hat and his kapota. He tore his kapota. He obviously had another one. And for 30 days, the Rebbe walked around with a hat and a kapota. At the end of Shloshim, the Rebbe took off the kapota and went back to the gray jacket. The black hat he kept. He stopped wearing a blue and a gray hat, but he put on the gray jacket again. And there's actually pictures of the Rebbe during that year with the short jacket and the black hat. So Reb Shmuel Levittin was a big chassid. He was almost a Frierdiker Rebbe's age. He knew without a shadow of a doubt He knew without a shadow of a doubt that the Rebbe has to be the next Rebbe. There was no other candidate. And he was very smart and very shrewd, and he tried all of his tricks to get the Rebbe to become a Rebbe. So he went up to the Rebbe and he said to the Rebbe that it's not appropriate for a Rebbe to wear a gray jacket, a pijak. So the Rebbe told him, if I'm not a Rebbe, what I do is my business, and if I am a Rebbe, I don't need your help. I can figure it out myself. That was classic of the period, Things began to change very fast. Very, very fast. Number one, as soon as the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, the Rebbe actually did what was needed for the Chassidim. He started writing letters. The day after Shiva, Yud Ches Shvat, Chai Shvat, the Rebbe gave out a kuntris of the Sichas Frierdiker Rebbe. It was the most recent Sicha. It was the Sicha of Chavdal Teves that the Frierdiker Rebbe had said some 2 weeks before. And in the Sicha he put an introductory letter. When the Rebbe used to print a sefer or even a pamphlet, he always put an introductory letter. But the introductory letters usually were 1 or 2 lines. In this pamphlet, you're going to find a Sicha from this and this date. At the end of the pamphlet, it's going to be a letter, and then it's going to be included minhagim of this, that, and the other. The Rebbe would just say what the pamphlet. As soon as the Frierdiker passed away, the Rebbe began to use these introductions as means of communicating with Hasidim. So on the one hand, the Rebbe is saying it has nothing to do with Rebbe, and it's not for him at all. On the other hand, in terms of actually giving inspiration and guidance, from the first minute, the Rebbe felt responsible for Anash, for Hasidim, and he did everything he could to help them. So over the course of that year or year and a half, the Rebbe would publish, let's say, 25 pamphlets of Chassidus or Sichos from the Frierdiker Rebbe. Every pamphlet came along with an introductory page, which was a long letter, where the Rebbe would talk about the Frierdiker Rebbe and would talk about his kashrus. For example, in this first letter, which is dated Yud Ches Shvat Tov Shin Yud, he quotes a letter that the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote after the Rebbe Rasha passed away, where he says that the Reye Neman, Reye Yisrael, Eine Eloi Yazev Tzein Marisa, a shepherd of Jewish people will not abandon his flock. Just like before, the Rebbe was serving the Chassidim, so he continues serving the Chassidim. He quoted from a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Frierdiker had written about his father, the Rebbe Nishmas Hayden. So the Rebbe really, he did for Chassidim everything Chassidim needed, except for officially taking the job, almost from the beginning. So he would send out these pamphlets. Each pamphlet would have an introductory letter from the Rebbe, which was now very, very important to Hasidim. And in addition, there would be a cover letter. In other words, if he sent a kuntris to France or to Israel, so in the kuntris there was a letter, but along with the kuntris there was a second letter. And the second letter also would have often an explanation of the letter he put in the beginning of the kuntris. So the Rebbe was immediately communicating with Hasidim the future of Hasidus, the future of Lubavitch, the future of Rebbe, but he saw himself, as he did before, as the Machnas HaMotzeh. He's in between the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Chassidim. He's encouraging the Chassidim to continue being connected to the Rebbe, to continue following the Rebbe's instructions, to support the Rebbe's institutions, but he never saw himself as the successor. He simply saw himself as the son-in-law. He did it before, and he's continuing to do it after. And this was very, very important. I mean, a lot of you girls have learned the famous letter about Nasi, right? The date of that letter is Gimel Tammuz Tov Shin Yud. You guys familiar with this letter? They teach it to all the girls. You know that letter was written in the beginning of one of these kuntreis. So mamish right away, the Rebbe began to take the responsibility for Anash without actually taking the position officially. He began to provide inspiration and encouragement to Hasidim and so on and so forth. And of course, people started asking him questions. You wanted to say something? Gimel Tammuz Tov Shin Yud, where he explains what is a Rebbe. People are asking what's the difference with the Frierdiker Rebbe and other Gedolei Yisrael, and he says the difference is that the Rebbe didn't have a job, didn't have a responsibility. His responsibility was the Jewish people. If it was Jewish, it was his business. There was no such thing as an affair of the Jewish people that he didn't personally engage with. That's what the Rebbe wrote in that letter. It's a very special letter. And he focuses on the word Nasi. I told you I wouldn't tell you, and I told you anyway. People start asking questions. All from overseas, the Rebbe was getting letters from all the Chassidim. Some of those letters were about whether the Rebbe is going to be a Rebbe or not. Some of those letters were simply asking advice, because people knew the Rebbe was very wise, and the Rebbe used to answer everybody, and he answered people right away. He answered people's questions, and he also used to say that he's taking your letters that you sent, I'm bringing them into the Frierdiker Rebbe's room, where he was Makabel Yidden to Yechidus, and I'm reading it there. Then I take it to the Oyel, and I read it a second time, and I leave it there. The Rebbe, the first year, every letter you sent to him, he would first read in the Frierdiker Rebbe's office upstairs, and then he would take it to the Oyel. After the first year, he discontinued this practice, and he would write back to people, I received your letter, I received your pan, I personally took it into the Rebbe Decher's Frierdiker Rebbe's room, and I read it there. Then I took it by the Oyel, and I read it again, and then the Rebbe would answer. Regarding your question, from the beginning, people were asking the Rebbe advice, and the Rebbe never shied away from giving advice. He answered all people's advice. But of course, it came in lieu of, he's a smart man, he's the son-in-law of a Rebbe. It wasn't yet that he's speaking with the authority of a Rebbe. An interesting little detail is, the Rebbe did not have an official stationery. He didn't have official stationery. But he had the stationery from the positions that he held in the organizations that he managed for the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe had an organization called Machane Yisrael. The Frierdiker Rebbe had an organization called Amerikas and Yonei Chinuch. They have very distinct stationaries. Machane Yisrael is one kind, it's the picture of the Luches, and the Amerikas and Chinuch has the logo, the long sort of round at the bottom logo with the flowers at the bottom. So there's two different sets of stationery. The Rebbe used to write his letters on the stationery of Machane and Merkez, and depending on the kind of letter you wrote, he would either answer you with the stationery of Machane or answer the stationery of Merkez. He initially didn't employ secretaries; he did it all himself. He used to type all. The Rebbe was a typist. The Rebbe used to type letters and send them to Chassidim. He also kept copies for himself of all these letters, which are now published in the Igros Kodesh, many of them. But people began to bother the Rebbe with questions and answers, and the Rebbe used to answer. There was a chassid in Europe who sort of asked the Rebbe, an elder chassid, someone much older than the Rebbe, asked the Rebbe, on what authority is he reading people's Pidyanos by the Frierdiker Rebbe? Like, sort of, you're saying you're not a Rebbe, but you're really doing a Rebbe thing. You're reading our letters, you're reading our Pidyanos that we sent to the Frierdiker Rebbe. It was an accusatory letter, actually, and the Rebbe responded by saying, I did this before. The Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't well. I always waited to the Frierdiker Rebbe on behalf of Hasidim. I'm simply continuing to do what I had done for the last 10 years. People send letters to the Rebbe. I bring them into the Rebbe. I read them to the letter. The Rebbe gives me the answers and I repeat them to you. So don't be sort of disappointed that I'm somehow acting in lieu of a Rebbe by reading the Pidyanos and the letters. I've been doing this for years. I'm just continuing doing a practice that I had done before. In addition to all of this, people kept coming into his office. I mean, the Rebbe's office was the office of the Merkez. Now, you guys can't understand this because today the Merkez office is not what it used to be. The Merkez office was a train station. The door was not locked. And we used to just walk. People used to walk into the Merkez office to ask them for a pen, which is such a chutzpah. The Rebbe's secretaries are so busy. People used to, Merkez had pen and paper, and you needed pen and paper. And Benjamin Klein was a very nice man, and they used to actually write in articles, don't bother the Maskirim for a pen. Their time is too important. The Merkez office wasn't locked. They were the Rebbe's secretaries. The Rebbe's office was the office of Merkez. The Rebbe's office wasn't locked. People would just walk into the Rebbe and talk to him. And the Rebbe had work to do. And anybody who walked in, the Rebbe would stop what he was doing, he would talk to you and go back to his work. Over the course of the next few months, the Rebbe Pashit did not have a minute. Because he would start to do something, someone would interrupt him. He would talk to that person that was very generous with his time, incredibly kind. He'd go, the guy would leave. 5 minutes, someone else came in. For months, this went on. That the Rebbe's door was like, mamish, like a revolving door. Just being opening and closing, one of those doors that just has it's on a hinge. It just springs open and closes. The Rebbe had no peace. So towards the end of the year, which was like 7 months into the period, the Rebbe finally asked that people shouldn't just walk in during the day. They should make an appointment with Rabbi Chadakov, and that they'll be allowed to see him that night. So you would go to Rabbi Chadakov, you'd register, and that night you went into the Rebbe. Originally it was 5 or 6 nights a week. It was certainly Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and probably Matzah Shabbos also. You went to the Chadakov, you got on the list, and you went to the Rebbe right away. When this happened, it was like Elul or Tishrei of Tafshin Yud. Chassidim saw this as a very, very positive sign, because it was actually an organizational thing. It was protocol. The Rebbe had a secretary, and the secretary was keeping care of his appointments. So the Rebbe was no longer bothered during the day, but from 8 o'clock at night, the Rebbe would see people. In the beginning, everybody who came on Tuesday saw him that day. Everybody who came on Wednesday saw him that day. Of course, over a very, very short period of time, that also changed because the Rebbe was so sought after. You have to understand, people came to see the Rebbe and went back to their communities and I met this son-in-law of the Rebbe. What a person! So 2 guys came the next day, yeah? They went back to their shul, so it took within a year or 2 or 3, everybody wanted the Rebbe's time. I don't mean Lubavitch. And everybody came here. So, of course, the Rebbe had a certain obligation to the Chabad community. Lubavitcher Hasidim had an easier time getting into the Rebbe than other people did, and there became this famous waiting list that you waited 6 months. 6 months for an appointment. 6 months. This started by the mid-50s. 6 months for an appointment, unless it was an emergency. Anash used to go in for their birthdays. But initially, the very, very, very beginning, you knocked on the door and walked in, and the Rebbe stopped what he was doing, and he would talk to you. And it became untenable. So then the Rebbe, like I said, towards the end of the year, the Rebbe asked that people should make appointments, and you would see the Rebbe that day. And the Rebbe became busier and busier. He fabrenged a lot. Much more than he fabrenged before. He didn't only fabreng Shabbos Avarchim, he fabrenged many more Shabboses. And people finally started to attend his fabrengings. I used to ask the Elter Chassidim if they remember the Rebbe's fabrengings before he was Rebbe. You know what they told me? We never went to the fabrengings. The Rebbe's Fabrengens, which were every Shabbos Avarchim, were attended by a couple of Yidden who were part of the 770 Minyan. Crown Heights was a modern neighborhood. There were not a lot of Orthodox Jews living in the neighborhood. There was a handful of Orthodox Jews who lived here, who joined 770 as members, because it was a close shul. Plenty of room, no problem. Every Shabbat, they made a Kiddush every Shabbos, but every Shabbos Avarchim they made a Kiddush that the Rebbe would sit down and sit at. There were 10 or 12 Yidden sitting at the table eating herring and crackers. Most of them were not even Lubavitch. There's a guy Roth who's been interviewed recently, a real interesting character. His father was the first Gabbai of 770 in 1940. He became the Gabbai because he lived on Eastern Parkway. He lived here. And he got from the Frierdiker Rebbe a whole spiel that they would encourage the Rebbe to join the Fabrengen Shabbos Avarchim. The Rebbe would come into the Fabrengen Shabbos Avarchim. He would sit for about an hour with his talis and his hat. You never knew if he was before davening or after davening. He would speak a sikha, like 35 or 40 minutes, and then walk out. Never touched the food. Never made kiddush. This was the Fabrengen Shabbos Avarchim. Nobody, it's hard to imagine. But Anash, I asked a Yid, a very Hasidic Yid, where were you when the Rebbe was Fabrengen? So he punched me. Where was I? I was davening by Arichist. All the Bachrim were davening. The Rebbe was sitting in Fabrengen. It was the Ramash. So there were special Fabrengens, like a Yitas Kislev, like a Yibis Tabbos. Then the Rebbe Fabreng, and Taka people came. But the Shabbos Avarchim Fabrengens, the Shabbos Fabrengens, nobody came. All of a sudden, there's pushing. Everybody wants to be there. The Ramash, he wasn't yet Rebbe, but he was Rebbe, you understand? So all of a sudden, the Rebbe started Fabrengen more often. In addition, the Rebbe used to edit the Fabrengens. Rabbi Yael Kahn was all of 20. He rolled into New York. It's such an interesting story. Rabbi Yael Kahn was an interesting story. When he was 5, the Frierdiker Rebbe sent the Rebbe to give him chocolate. The Frierdiker Rebbe sent the Rebbe to give chocolate to Yael Kahn. The Frierdiker Rebbe did not send the Rebbe to give chocolate to all children who passed through Perkersdorf. The Frierdiker Rebbe sent the Rebbe to give chocolate to Yael Kahn. I once confronted Yael Kahn about it, and he got so upset. It didn't happen that way. The problem is Yael Kahn's father wrote the story in a book. That's how I know it. His father wrote the story. Yael was a boy. The Frierdiker Rebbe sent him to give him chocolate. Now Yael Kahn was in Eretz Yisrael. Rashag came to Israel in 1949. Rashag said a maimer. When he finished saying the maimer, this 19-year-old shnuk tells him, say another one. So the Rashag takes a look at this shnuk and says, excuse me, first you'll review the one I said, and when you'll know, say another one. He says, I know it already. He says, you know it? Give it back to me. So Rabbi Yael gave it back to him like a tape recorder. So he said a second maimer. And when he finished, Mr. Nut say a third one. So Rashag says, wait a minute, review the second one. He said, I know it already. Anyway, he was a tape recorder. In those days, besides for having a very deep mind, he had an incredible memory. Rashag wrote to the Frierdiker Rebbe, I met this guy. He's like a machine. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, bring him here. Rabbi Yael came. He arrived right after the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. He was not by the Levaya. He left Israel before the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, and he arrived afterwards. When he got here, he very quickly picked on what's going on. He's very smart. He figured out what's going on right away. You know, the Rashag and the Rebbe. Rashag brought him here. Rashag paid for him to come to America, so he was very respectful of Rashag. But it took him a minute and a half to understand that it's where the Ramash. He became very attached to the Rebbe. He used to use Rashag's typewriter to type up the Rebbe's sichos. But he was very careful not to be disrespectful of the Rashag. And he actually went over to the Rebbe and he said, the Frierdiker Rebbe said I should come. But now the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, should I go back to Israel? And the Rebbe told him, the Rebbe the Shver, the Frierdiker Rebbe knew that this was going to happen, and nevertheless he told you to come, so that means that you're supposed to stay. And years later, the Rebbe once told Rabbi Yael that he's Deilu Mashke Metedes Rabbi Lachedim. For many, many years, he was the only person who was able to collect a Fabrengen of the Rebbe with so much. He had such a strong mind and such a deep understanding and such an incredible memory. I mean, a lot of the Torah we have from the Rebbe, this was his job. He's the chayzer. It's not simple. The Rebbe sent the Rebbe to give him chocolate when he was a 4-year-old. Even though Rabbi Yael got upset when I asked him about the story, I don't think it was just because he was a cute little kid he got chocolate. This was Yael Khan. So the Bachim started writing up the Fabrengens. And they asked the Rebbe to edit the Fabrengens, and the Rebbe edited them, and then they typed them up and they started to sell them. And they created a phantom. It was called Vad Lafotzas Sichos, or Vad Lafotzas Chasidus. And they never signed any names. So they made it sound like this is an organization with a bunch of Elter Chassidim who were sitting together responsibly and prepared to talk. So would write letters to Chassidim all over the world. B'Shem Avad was a 20-year-old and a 19-year-old and an 18-year-old and a 22-year-old, a bunch of Bachrim. And they would get these very respectful responses from Chassidim with white beards. Thank you for sending us the Sichos, and please send us more, and this is the address, and how much we pay for it, and so forth. And they began to disseminate the Rebbe Sichos this way. And the beginning, the Rebbe edited a lot. The first year, once he became a Rebbe, he stopped editing, but the first year he edited a lot. And again, there was a chassid who asked the Rebbe, what's this business you editing your Sichos? And the Rebbe said very simply, if you gave me the Sichos 5 years ago, I would edit them also. You were just not interested. If you asked me to look over what I said and to correct it in that manner, I would have done it 5 years ago too. You just didn't think to do it. You're doing it now, I'm editing it. So, on the one hand, there's this whole, I'm not becoming a Rebbe, forget about it. But on the other hand, everything a Rebbe does, he did from the beginning. You know, people had different experiences, but more or less, the Rebbe began to relate to Chassidim, especially the young ones, as that he did everything a Rebbe does except for carry the hat. The Elter Chassidim, the Chassidim who were older than him, this was already different. This was the story. And then, of course, the official position, the official assumption of leadership was something that was going to take the Rebbe time. Amongst the stories that happened during this period were the following. The Rebbe called a meeting of Anash. And he asked that the Bachrim shouldn't be at the meeting. So the Bachrim were under the table at the meeting. As Rabbi Yael Khan describes it in his Rishim, they were all there under the table. And the Rebbe didn't see them, of course. He called a meeting and he said to the people like this, there's a huge demand on my time. Everybody needs more from me than they needed from me before. And I understand that, Rebbe. I understand it. And I'm prepared to give more of my time. But you have to understand, I was given a shlichus, the Rebbe said. The Frierdiker Rebbe gave me a job. That job is Merkez Ne'er Chinuch above all else, and then Machne Yisrael, Sfarim Kahas, all the different jobs that Rebbe gave. He says, understand, my job will get done. So it's very simple. If you help me with my job, I'll have time for things that you want. If you're not going to help me with my job, then I'm just going to do my job, and I'm going to tell you, I'm sorry, there's a din kedima to my shlichus. I'm a servant of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe gave me a certain shlichus, and I am going to do what I'm meant to do, and it'll be at the expense of others. So it was this meeting, and at the end of the meeting, the Rebbe was asking people to pledge to help raise money. With Anash, with Lubavitch Chassidim. That they should pledge to raise money, that the Rebbe should have to raise money himself. So Yael Khan says he was at the meeting under the table. Nothing actionable happened. The Rebbe made a speech. Chassidim answered him, but nobody actually said, okay, I'm going to raise money like this, like that. It was just talk. Kazanovsky was a very Chassidish Yid, Rabbi Kazanovsky. Kazanovsky also was an incredible fundraiser. He has a lot of money for the Lubavitch all the years. Very dedicated to the Rebbe. And he was the Rebbe's chassid the day the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away. He got very emotional, and he started to scream. And he said, we are going to be with you just like we were with the Frierdiker Rebbe. We're going to stand by you and we're going to support you. We'll do everything we can to help you. Just lead. But that's where it ended. It was just an outpouring of emotion. Practically no practical decisions were made. No practical actions were proposed. But they had this very, very emotional meeting. Mamish, I think it was a month after Frierdiker Rebbe passed away when this meeting took place. There is a rumor which I cannot confirm. There's a rumor that I cannot confirm. I tried very hard, but the rumor is that the Rebbe actually sat with the Bachrim. The Bachrim were very broken after the Istalkus. The Bachrim was 770. They couldn't understand how it could be. The Rebbe talked so much about Mashiach. And the Rebbe pushed it. Again, I know of people who were at this meeting, but they would not utter an iota. There was apparently a meeting with the American Bachrim after Yud Shvat. I don't know when it occurred. I don't know what was discussed. I have a very hard to corroborate rumor about such a meeting. It may not be true. I'm telling you that up front, but I think it is. But I know nothing of what occurred at that meeting. I know absolutely nothing of what occurred at that meeting. Pesach. There was a Seder upstairs, if he came his apartment, and now the doors were not locked. The Seder always was that the Frierdiker Rebbe had meals, Shabbos and Yom Tov, and people wanted to get in, because every single meal of Shabbos, every single meal of Yom Tov was a Fabreng, and the Rebbe used to say Sipurim, and Chasidei Shaverter, and they sing Nigunim, but they didn't let anybody in. The Rebbe had very difficult, he had cardiovascular trouble, he had heart trouble, it was very hard for him to breathe. So he needed a lot of air, so they would very limit who was allowed in. It was very controlled. So most of the Chassidim who came to 770 on a weekly basis or on a Yom Tov basis ended up standing on the steps. Frierdiker passes away, and there's no lock. Anybody can walk in, and nobody came. So by the first Seder, the Rebbe is sitting at the Seder, the Rashag is sitting opposite him, the Frierdiker Rebbe's seat is empty. They always prepared for him matzah and his becher, like as if it was before Yud Shvat. And the Rebbe says, last year people came with their afikoymen. The minhag used to be that you would make your Seder in your house till after Shulchan Aruch, then you would take your afikoymen, if it wasn't Shabbos, you would carry it to 770 and hope to eat it in the same room with the Frierdiker Rebbe. Most people ended up eating the afikoymen on the steps. They didn't let him in. He says, Farayar, they mentioned, they ended up eating the afikoymen on the steps, say they can walk in, and no one's coming. And he said, this place is the place where the last 10 years the Rebbe de Shved, the Frierdiker Rebbe served the Eibush, he learned here and he davened here and he served the Jewish people with the letzte koiches, with whatever little strength he had left. And the Rebbe used the expression, Ken den sein aggressere gilui videm. Can there be a greater revelation than this? Because like it doesn't Kabbalah Svarim, the Kedusha Ein Zazim Im Koy Ma'rishon Lagamri. When Kedusha comes to a place, it never leaves. So he says, the Rebbe was here. So he's still here. Why didn't anybody come to Afikoymen? Anyway, the next night everybody came already. They heard what the Rebbe said, so the following night they came and let him in. And for many years people were allowed into the meals until the meals became very, very pushy, and then they had to make controls. This was one thing that occurred. There's a lot of details, but another thing that happened was Shavuos. So I told you about Lag BaOmer. I told you about Lag BaOmer or not? And the Rebbe kept on saying, the Rebbe kept on saying that the Frierdiker Rebbe never told him to be a Rebbe. So Lag BaOmer, 10 Hasidim went to the oil, and they said to the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Rebbe keeps on saying there is no Hira. The Rebbe went to the oil that day, he never used that excuse again, he just used other excuses. There was a chassid by the name of Rabbi Simpson, Rabbi Eli Eichel Simpson. He was a very deep chassid. He was a giant, a big lamdan and a big maskell, but a big oivid. And he was very close to the Frierdiker Rebbe, was very close to the Rebbe. He was a Amis Achsidish Yid. He was a real chassid. He had a shul in Borough Park, and he used to walk into the Fabrengens. So Matzah Shavuos, he walked in Borough to the Fabrengen, and the Rebbe was Fabrenging Matzah Shavuos, and he said to the Rebbe, what about a Maimech Chassidus? The Rebbe was saying Sichas, and at that point the Rebbe was actually editing his Sichas. So he said to the Rebbe, what about the Rebbe saying a Maimech Chassidus? He was not the first person to ask, but the Rebbe said to him, es darf nicht sein, darf geitzt. It doesn't necessarily have to happen now. Which was a huge step forward. Because until that point, if you asked the Rebbe for my Chassidus, you got a blank stare, like what kind of nonsense are you speaking? The Rebbe didn't say no, he just said not now. On Shavuos Tafshin Yud. He said, there's daf nicht dain daf. It could be a different time. And that's exactly how it would play it. Daf nicht dain daf ge'itzter. I heard from people that the tradition was that the kinder from the Rebbe, the Rashag, for example, and others, the Rebbe's mishpacha, when a kid, when a child of a Rebbe came to a city, he would chazer a Maimech Chassidus. That was standard. You say a Maimech Chassidus. The Rebbe didn't do that. The Rebbe never said a Maimech Chassidus. Before the Rebbe was the Rebbe never said a Maimer. He would say Sichas. He would use the content of a Maimer, but to say a Maimer with a niggin, the way the Maimer is written, the Rebbe would not do it before he became Rebbe. And the first occasion was Taka Yud Shvat Tov Shin Yud Aleph, which I'm going to have to get to later on. The Rashag did, yes. And many older, the Frierdiker Rebbe did it when his father was alive. It was the Chabad culture. Chabad culture was, a Rebbe Sakint, a Rebbe, a child, came to town, he would chazer Amayim Chassidus. That was the minute. Huh? No, from the Rebbe. He wasn't his own Chassidus. Yeah? That was Shavuos. Overseas, there were huge efforts made to encourage the Rebbe to become a Rebbe. There were meetings in Israel, in Europe, in other places, and they talked about the fact that they sort of all agreed that the Ramash has to be Rebbe. How do we do it? In New York, it was very difficult because, as you know from the story of the Sfarim, locally there was never, unfortunately, a politics. But the Chassidim here worked very hard. I heard from people who are very critical, very political. They said, you have to give the Chassidim credit. But they made the Rebbe, and they took huge risks because the Rebbe Tzemach HaMedina was alive and well. And it made it very, very difficult. The Rebbe kept saying that he was Najah B'chlal. And on the one hand, he didn't want it. On the other hand, if he wants it, he wants it completely. And they had all of these meetings, and they wrote letters. There's a very interesting letter from a Yid named Reb Sheil Bruch, Chaim Shaul Bruch, written to Rabbi Jacobson in New York, written in Iyad, Tafshin Yud. Fascinating letter. He asks Rabbi Saul Jacobson, so what's happening in 770? What's going to be the future? Is there going to be a Rebbe? Are we going to be like the Breslev? And he writes, are we going to be like the Breslev? And one of the things he writes is, so Rabbi Jacobson wrote to him that there's a Ramash, there's a Rebbe, and everybody knows this is it. We're just trying to make it all happen. So Rabbi Sheil Bruch told him in the Kemaisa that he heard from a Yid whose name was Chanin. I forgot his first name. This guy Chanin was in Lastov in Tafresh Peyalf in 1921 or 1920. The Rogatchover came to Rostov. The Rogatchover Gaon, who lived in Dvinsk and then later in Leningrad, came to the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rogatchover was around the same age as the Rebbe Rashab. He was much older than the Frierdiker Rebbe. I think he was older than the Rebbe. It was a whole generation of Frierdiker. Frierdiker Rebbe was then 40 or 41. The Rogatchover was in his 60s. When the Rogatchover came, so they ran out to Makabel Ponim, and he was a legend in his own time. He was a Gaon, he was a Gadol B'Yisrael. And they gave him Shalom. And they ran into the Frierdiker Rebbe, but tell the Frierdiker Rebbe the Rogatchover is here. And the Frierdiker Rebbe came out to Makabel Ponim. So the Chassidim asked the Rogatchover, why did you come? So he said, Ich bin gekommen geben dem Rebbe Smicha. I came to give the Frierdiker Rebbe Smicha. He came to the Rebbe to give the Rebbe Smicha. The Rogatchover was a Nigla person, but he also was a Chassidish. He was a Chassid. And he said, I came to support the Frierdiker Rebbe, give him Smicha. So him and the Rebbe went into a room for 4 hours. The two of them sat for 4 hours and talked. And by the way, later on, he was in Leningrad. When the Rebbe was in Leningrad, they were very, very, very close. That even though he was older and the Rebbe was younger, he would run to the Frierdiker Rebbe like a boy. He coined the phrase Nasi. You know, Nasi Dereinu, where does that expression come from? It's a Nigla expression. It's a halachic expression. The Rogatchover referred to the Frierdiker Rebbe as Nasi. That's where the Rebbe used that term all the time. But the Rogatchover was the one who coined the expression. He walked out of the Frierdiker Rebbe's room after 4 hours, and of course, immediately, the Chassidim surrounded him, and he said, Yidden darf haben a Nasi. He used the expression Nasi. Yidden need a Nasi, a prince, a leader, a head. Ubefrat as is royal, especially since he's deserving of the title. And then he said weird words. A son-in-law comes before anybody else, and a son comes before anybody else. At the time, it didn't make any sense. Why? The Frierdiker Rebbe was the Rebbe Rashab's son. He should have simply said, B'nai Kaidam. The Rogatchover, not only did he say, Chosnei Kaidam before, he said it before Ben. Before he said, B'nai Kaidam, he said Chosnei. So 30 years later, the Sheil Bruch says, I heard the story 30 years ago, that the Rogatchover said, a son-in-law precedes everybody else to his succession, and a son, maybe the Rogatchover's words that came out 30 years ago will push it to portend where Ruach HaKodesh going forward. And these were the kinds of things that were happening, and I'm going to continue the rest of the story with Seminary Aleph. If you really want to hear the whole story, I'll be happy to send it to you. I'm telling the story. Yeah, be well.